Continue our focus on international affairs now. Sam Roggeveen, the Director of International Security at the Lowy Institute. Thanks so much for your time. Let's start with the comments of two air marshals, former air marshals in The Australian today, Catherine McGregor's report, which suggests we need a complete rethink in terms of our strategic outlook and our defence approach. What do you make of their comments?
Yeah, look, very, very interesting to get them coming out publicly this way. I think I agree very much with the sentiment that we've been focused far too much on the Middle East and on counter-terrorism operations, where our core national interests really are not at stake, and where I think a lot of the hard yards can really be done by policing and good intelligence work. And the Defence Forces do need to refocus on the threat of major power conflict.
But the same could be said of the US, couldn't it, in terms of, and I know, having spoken to various US military over the years, that they feel that their resources have been diverted to the Middle East when Pacific Command, which is in Honolulu, is the one that looks at our region, and China particularly, and that's been under-resourced traditionally because of the funding, the diversion to the Middle East. So the same could be said of the US, couldn't it?
Absolutely, and I think there is clear frustration on the part of the American military on this question, and they clearly see China in particular as a peer competitor to the United States, and that America needs to prepare militarily for a future like that. Unfortunately, politically in the United States, it's a bit like that classic line from The Godfather where Michael Corleone says, "Every time I think I'm out, they pull me back in," and America just can't help getting itself involved in the Middle East time and time again. It's happening again. So that frustration, I think, will continue. But also, I think Australia needs to plan for a future in which the United States may not be engaged as much as we hope it will. And that was the other interesting aspect about this intervention from the two air marshals, is that they talked about a future in which the United States is less reliable, so we have to do more of the heavy lifting ourselves.
The thing is, this isn't the first time we've had this argument advanced by former chiefs. We've had Peter Lay on the show say a very similar thing. But the thing is, why is it such a two-option scenario? Why is it one or the other that we have to focus on the Middle East or our region? Don't we have the resources to do both well?
Actually, we don't, no. So we are increasing our defence spending, but no government is going to find it very easy to increase defence spending in such a way that we could do both of those in the way that we're doing them, maintain a focus on the Middle East, but also build a defence force that would actually keep us safe from an adversary on the scale that we're talking about with China right now. And of course, nobody's saying that war is likely with China. In fact, it's still very unlikely, maybe slightly less unlikely than it used to be. But the point is not for Australia that we fear war. The point is that we have the military capabilities so that we cannot be coerced. Okay, so China has strategic objectives that are very different to ours. And so we, as a nation, don't ever want to be in a position where we can be coerced. We always want to be able to hold our own.
And how does our Air Force enhance its range? How does it also, as they argued today in the newspaper, in The Australian, improve their impact? And also the idea of land-based missiles, how does that fit in?
So here's the bit where I disagree with the two air marshals, who talk very much about increasing Australia's offensive capabilities. Previously, we had experts talking about the ability to rip an arm off an adversary, such as China, for instance. I don't think that's the right way forward for Australia, mainly because China is so powerful that if we went down that path of having the capability to strike back at China, then effectively China would always be able to dominate in a contest like that, would always have the capability to go further than we would. So our focus should not be on offensive capabilities, it should be on defensive capabilities. How do we develop a defence force that makes it impossible, or at least incredibly costly, for China to coerce us? So that's the kind of defence force we need to build.
Now, you've got your book out today. It's on a very different subject. It's titled Our Very Own Brexit, Australia's Politics and Where It Could Lead Us.
Yeah.
I haven't had a look at it just yet. It's only being launched today, but talk us through exactly the key argument in this book?
So it's an unusual book for me as someone who's focused on defence, also an unusual book for the Lowy Institute. What I've tried to do actually is reverse the perspective that the Lowy Institute generally takes. Our job is to look out onto the world. What I've tried to do is look at world politics and give a sense of what implications that's having for Australia. So we very rarely look at Australian politics that way. But what I see when I look at the democratic world in particular, I see political trends in the democratic world that are also reflected here in Australia and that are going to make our politics much less stable. And the big one, the really big one that stands out, that's happening in the United States, in Europe, and in the United Kingdom, is that in all of those places, the big centre-right and centre-left parties are declining. And that's happening here as well. Even at the last election, when the coalition, even though it won a surprise victory, their primary vote nevertheless went into decline, and Labor's primary vote is now at pretty disastrously low levels. And when that happens, when big major parties around which our politics is built, when they start to go into decline, politics becomes less stable. And I'd argue that's how Brexit happened, and that's how these new populist right-wing parties came to power or came to greater prominence in Europe, and also it's how Trump happened. The big parties are getting weaker and it makes our system much less stable.
Can you argue that the rise of populism, though, is inextricably linked with the rise of extremism? Is that what you're proposing?
Actually, the opposite. I think that the case that there is rising right-wing extremist sentiment in Europe has been overstated. So I think there's always been an element of opinion that's attracted to the kind of politics represented by these new populist parties that we see in Europe. But previously, it's been locked up by the big parties, by the old parties. That's not the case anymore. Those parties are so much weaker that those people who are attracted to right-wing populist ideas, they now roam around more freely with their vote. The good news is, actually, on that front, is that those populist parties are going to find it just as hard to hang on to voters as the traditional parties are now finding. So the lesson here really is that voters are much more volatile, and politics is going to become democratic politics is going to become a lot less stable.
Sam Roggeveen, Director of International Security Program at Lowy. Great to see you.
Good, thank you.
All the best with the book. I look forward to reading it.